The unassuming passenger. The sun blazed over the tarmac as passengers boarded Flight 872, bound for Chicago. Among them was Kayla Henderson, a soft-spoken yet determined young woman who carried herself with a quiet dignity. Her dark skin glowed in the sunlight as she adjusted her tote bag over one shoulder, her other hand clutching a neatly folded blazer. Kayla wasn't just another passenger. She was the owner of a small but rapidly growing tech startup, her hard work and resilience finally granting her the luxury of a first-class seat on this flight. She presented her boarding pass with a polite smile to the attendant at the gate, who barely glanced at her before waving her through. Kayla had grown used to such dismissive gestures, but refused to let them dampen her spirits. She stepped onto the plane, her heels clicking softly against the floor, and began weaving through the narrow aisle toward her seat in first class. Her reserved demeanor belied her excitement. This trip wasn't just a business expense, it was a personal victory. After years of taking red-eye flights and enduring cramped economy seats, Kayla had finally afforded the luxury of traveling in comfort. She found her assigned seat near the window and placed her blazer on the armrest before sliding her tote bag under the seat. Seated next to her was an older gentleman with a warm smile and a stack of legal briefs on his lap. He glanced up and nodded politely. Kayla returned the gesture before settling into her seat and pulling out her tablet. She began reviewing her presentation for a critical investor meeting scheduled later that day. Her focus was intense, her stylus gliding across the screen as she made last-minute edits, a shadow over first class. Minutes later, the hum of the boarding process was interrupted by the brisk footsteps of the lead flight attendant, Morgan Shaw. Known among her colleagues for her strict demeanor and sharp tongue, Morgan was a veteran in the airline industry. Her uniform was impeccably pressed, her hair pulled into a severe bun that only added to her air of authority. Morgan scanned the cabin with a practiced eye, her gaze lingering on each passenger for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. When her eyes landed on Kayla, her expression faltered ever so slightly before hardening into a polite but unmistakably cold stare. "Excuse me," Morgan said, her tone sharp but controlled as she approached Kayla. "May I see your boarding pass?" Kayla blinked, momentarily caught off guard, but handed over her pass without hesitation. "Of course." Morgan scrutinized the ticket, her lips tightening into a thin line. "I see," she said after a pause that felt deliberately prolonged. "I'll be back in a moment." Before Kayla could respond, Morgan pivoted and strode toward the galley, where she huddled with another flight attendant, her voice low but laced with urgency. Kayla could feel the weight of their glances as they periodically looked her way. Her grip on the stylus tightened, though her face remained calm. Years of navigating microaggressions had taught her the importance of composure. When Morgan returned, her expression had shifted to one of forced politeness. "Miss Henderson," she began, "it seems there may have been an issue with your booking. Could I ask you to step aside while we sort this out?" Kayla frowned but nodded, rising from her seat. She followed Morgan toward the galley, where the hum of the engines barely masked the whispers of curious passengers behind her. Once they were out of earshot, Morgan folded her arms and leaned slightly forward, her voice dropping to a harsher tone. "We'll need you to move to the main cabin. There seems to have been a mix-up with your ticket." Kayla's brow furrowed, her voice steady but tinged with confusion. "There must be a mistake. I confirmed this ticket weeks ago. It's non-transferable and explicitly for first class." Morgan's expression stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I'm afraid there's no room for discussion. Either you comply, or I'll have to involve security." The quiet resolve. The threat hung in the air, but Kayla refused to rise to it. Instead, she gave Morgan a measured look, one that carried the weight of a woman who had faced far greater challenges. "Fine," she said softly, her tone even but firm. "Lead the way." As they walked toward the back of the plane, Kayla's presence seemed to command the attention of every passenger they passed. Whispers spread like wildfire, and heads turned to follow her as she was escorted to a cramped seat in the main cabin. Kayla placed her bag under the seat and sat down, her movements deliberate and composed, though her heart burned with indignation. In the galley, Morgan exhaled sharply, pleased with how she had handled the situation. She glanced toward the main cabin, where Kayla now sat, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smirk. Her victory, however, was short-lived. Kayla retrieved her phone from her tote bag, her fingers moving swiftly across the screen. She sent a short but decisive message, then leaned back in her seat, her expression unreadable. To the passengers around her, she appeared unbothered, even serene. But beneath her calm exterior, a storm was brewing, a storm that would soon engulf the entire airline. The ripple effect begins. Unbeknownst to Morgan, Kayla wasn't just any passenger. She was a rising star in the tech world, with connections that spanned industries far beyond what Morgan could imagine. The message Kayla had sent wasn't to a friend or family member, but to one of her investors, a high-ranking member of the airline's board of directors. As the plane began taxiing down the runway, a chain of events had already been set into motion, one that would unravel faster than anyone anticipated. Kayla leaned her head against the window, her fingers drumming lightly against her armrest. She knew it was only a matter of time before the consequences of Morgan's actions came back to haunt her. Morgan, oblivious to the storm brewing just behind her, continued her duties with practiced efficiency, but even she couldn't ignore the growing whispers among passengers, some of whom cast disapproving glances in her direction. A seed of doubt began to take root in her mind, though she brushed it aside, convincing herself that she had acted appropriately. As the flight settled into its rhythm, Kayla sat quietly in her new seat, her expression calm but her mind razor-sharp. The first battle had been fought, and while she had conceded the seat, the war was far from over. The unfolding storm. The airplane soared through the skies, its engines humming steadily against the endless backdrop of clouds. In the economy cabin, Kayla Henderson sat silently by the window, her face calm but her mind in overdrive. Her earlier text message had already sparked a chain of actions behind the scenes, a series of events that no one on the flight, least of all the lead flight attendant, Morgan Shaw, could have anticipated. Kayla was no stranger to challenges. She built her company from the ground up, navigating obstacles ranging from institutional biases to blatant discrimination. This situation was just another hurdle, and she approached it with the same precision that had propelled her to success. She wasn't going to let one flight attendant's arrogance define her experience, and certainly not her day. Pulling her phone from her tote bag once more, Kayla scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed. The name on the screen brought a small, knowing smile to her lips. Marcia Fletcher, Board of Directors. Marcia wasn't just an investor in Kayla's startup. She was a close friend and a fiercely protective mentor who also happened to wield significant influence in the airline's executive circle. Kayla typed a brief message. Kayla, there's been an issue on Flight 872. I've been moved from first class under false pretenses. I need this addressed, but let's keep it professional. You know how I operate. Within moments, the 3 dots indicating Marcia's response appeared. Marcia, say no more. Consider it handled. Keep me updated. Kayla locked her phone and slid it back into her bag, her face giving away nothing. She had played her part. Now it was time to let the wheels of justice turn. The warning signs. Meanwhile, in the galley, Morgan felt a faint but persistent unease. It wasn't just the disapproving glances from some of the passengers, or the murmurs she couldn't quite catch. It was something about Kayla herself. Her calmness, her refusal to argue or plead. Most passengers in her position would have made a scene, but Kayla's composure felt calculated, as though she had something up her sleeve. Morgan brushed the thought aside, forcing herself to focus on her duties. She grabbed a tray of drinks and moved through the first-class cabin, her practiced smile firmly in place. But as she approached one of the passengers, an older woman with a sharp gaze stopped her mid-step. "Excuse me, young lady," the woman said, her tone polite but firm. "I couldn't help but notice the incident earlier." That young woman you moved to the back, was there a valid reason for it? Morgan's smile faltered. There was a misunderstanding with her booking, she said, her voice tight. It's been resolved. The woman raised an eyebrow. A misunderstanding, you say? I saw her ticket. It was for first class. Care to explain further? Morgan stiffened. I assure you, ma'am, everything is under control. The woman gave a slow nod, her expression unreadable. I hope so, she said, her words laced with a quiet warning. As Morgan walked away, she felt the woman's eyes boring into her back. It was unsettling, to say the least. A quiet alliance. In the economy cabin, Kayla noticed the younger flight attendant, Clara, approaching her with a small tray. Clara's demeanor was markedly different from Morgan's, soft-spoken and empathetic, with a genuine concern that she struggled to hide. Miss Henderson, Clara said gently, placing a cup of water and a package of almonds on Kayla's tray table. I just wanted to make sure you're comfortable. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask. Kayla looked up, her expression softening. Thank you, Clara. I appreciate it. Clara hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if to ensure Morgan wasn't nearby. Then, lowering her voice, she added, I saw what happened earlier. I'm really sorry. You didn't deserve that. Kayla's lips curled into a faint smile. It's not your fault, she said, her tone calm but resolute. But thank you for saying so. Clara lingered for a moment, clearly wanting to say more, but the sound of Morgan's sharp voice calling her name from the galley made her retreat. Kayla watched her go, her respect for the young attendant growing. In contrast to Morgan's arrogance, Clara's humanity shone through. And it didn't go unnoticed. The first strike. Back in the galley, Morgan was beginning to feel the first tangible consequences of her actions. Dennis, the senior flight attendant, approached her with a furrowed brow and a clipboard in hand. Morgan, he began, his voice low but firm, we just got a call from the executive office. They're requesting a detailed report about the passenger you moved. Morgan's face paled. What? Why? Dennis's expression hardened. Apparently, that passenger has connections, high-level connections. They're monitoring the situation as we speak. Morgan's heart sank. She had acted on impulse, assuming she could assert her authority without repercussions. Now, it seemed, she had miscalculated, badly. You'd better make sure the rest of this flight goes smoothly, Dennis added, his tone carrying a hint of warning. And I'd start thinking about how you're going to explain yourself when we land. A network of influence. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, Kayla's earlier message to Marcia had already set a ripple effect into motion. Marcia wasn't one to let such incidents slide, especially not when they involved someone she cared about. She immediately contacted the airline's CEO, a no-nonsense woman named Eleanor Stokes, and relayed the situation in detail. Eleanor was known for her zero-tolerance policy on discrimination and misconduct. Within minutes, she had issued a directive to the flight crew of Flight 872, instructing them to rectify the situation immediately and ensure Kayla's comfort for the remainder of the flight. She also made it clear that the incident would be thoroughly investigated upon landing. Back on the plane, Morgan's unease grew with every passing moment. She couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in, though she couldn't yet see how. She moved through the cabin, her smile more forced than ever, as passengers began to pick up on the tension. Kayla, meanwhile, remained seated in the economy cabin, her calm composure unwavering. She wasn't one to celebrate prematurely, but she knew that the tide was beginning to turn. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcia. Marcia, the CEO is aware. Expect an apology, public or private, your choice. Let me know how you want to proceed. Kayla's lips curled into a subtle smile as she read the message. She replied, Kayla, let's wait until we land. I want to see how they handle this on their own. Building pressure. The plane's intercom crackled to life, interrupting the cabin's subdued hum. Ladies and gentlemen, came the voice of Captain Harris, calm but authoritative. We'd like to thank you for choosing to fly with us today. We'll be beginning our descent shortly, so please ensure your seatbelts are fastened." Morgan felt a flicker of relief at the announcement. The flight was almost over, and she hoped to salvage what was left of her professional reputation. But as she glanced toward the economy cabin, where Kayla sat poised and unbothered, a knot of dread tightened in her stomach. The storm was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The descent of consequences. The atmosphere aboard Flight 872 grew heavier as the plane began its descent toward Chicago. What had started as a seemingly routine flight had unraveled into an intricate web of tension and whispers. Kayla Henderson sat quietly in her cramped seat in the economy cabin, her calm demeanor masking a storm of activity happening beyond the clouds. Her phone buzzed softly in her lap, a discreet notification from Marcia Fletcher. Kayla glanced down, her eyes scanning the message. "Marcia, Eleanor has issued a formal order. The flight crew will address you directly upon landing. They're scrambling, but the CEO wants this corrected immediately. Do you want this public or private?" Kayla's response was measured, her words carefully chosen. "Kayla, public. Let's set a precedent." She tucked her phone back into her tote bag, her expression giving nothing away. To the casual observer, she was just another passenger waiting for the plane to touch down. But those paying closer attention, like the elderly man across the aisle or the observant young woman 2 rows ahead, could sense that Kayla was no ordinary traveler. The brewing storm in first class. In the first-class cabin, Morgan Shaw's movements had grown increasingly rigid. Her usual confidence had been replaced with a nervous energy that she struggled to suppress. She had avoided making eye contact with Dennis, the senior flight attendant, who now watched her with thinly veiled disapproval. Dennis leaned against the galley counter, his arms crossed. "You've really stepped in it this time," he said, his tone sharp. "Do you have any idea who that woman is?" Morgan's jaw tightened. "She's just a passenger who didn't belong in first class," she snapped defensively. Dennis raised an eyebrow. "Didn't belong?" His voice dripped with incredulity. "Are you hearing yourself? You moved someone with a confirmed first-class ticket to economy, and now the executive office is breathing down our necks. I've been in this business long enough to know when someone's made a mistake they can't walk back." Morgan glared at him but said nothing. Deep down, she knew he was right. She had acted impulsively, and now the consequences were barreling toward her like a freight train. The observant passengers. Meanwhile, the murmurs among passengers had become more pronounced. News of Kayla's removal from first class had spread quickly, aided by the growing unease in the flight crew's demeanor. The elderly man across from Kayla, who had introduced himself earlier as Mr. Langston, leaned over again. "You seem awfully calm for someone who's just been unjustly moved," he remarked, his voice tinged with curiosity. Kayla looked up from her window, offering a faint smile. "Let's just say I've learned not to fight battles I've already won," she replied cryptically. Mr. Langston chuckled, though his eyes were sharp with understanding. "Smart woman. I get the sense that you're not someone to be underestimated." Kayla's smile widened slightly. "I try not to be." 2 rows ahead, a young woman with a sleek laptop and noise-canceling headphones discreetly typed on her keyboard. Her curiosity about the situation had prompted her to do some quick internet sleuthing. It didn't take long for her to connect the dots. Kayla Henderson, founder and CEO of a tech startup that had been making waves in Silicon Valley, was not only a prominent figure, but also someone with considerable influence. The young woman turned her screen away from view, her fingers flying over the keys as she began drafting a tweet. At passenger witness. On Flight 872. First-class passenger with a confirmed ticket was just moved to economy under suspicious circumstances. Attendant looks nervous now. Something tells me this story isn't over. #airline drama. The captain's directive. In the cockpit, Captain Harris received a second call from the executive office. This one was more urgent than the first. "Captain Harris, "This is Eleanor Stokes," came the voice of the airline's CEO. "I trust you've been briefed on the situation regarding Miss Henderson." "Yes, ma'am," Harris replied, his tone measured. "We're monitoring the situation closely." "Good," Eleanor continued. "Let me be perfectly clear. This incident cannot be swept under the rug. Miss Henderson is not only a valuable customer, but also a figure of public interest. Ensure she's treated with the utmost respect, and prepare your crew for a formal apology upon landing. I'll handle the aftermath personally." "Yes, ma'am," Harris said again, his voice firm. "It will be handled." As the call ended, Harris leaned back in his seat, his expression grim. He activated the intercom, addressing the lead flight attendant directly. "Miss Shaw, please report to the cockpit immediately." Morgan's stomach twisted as she heard the announcement. She set down the tray she was holding and made her way to the cockpit, her heels clicking against the floor. When she arrived, Captain Harris didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Miss Shaw," he began, his tone sharp, "I've just spoken to the CEO. We've received direct instructions to rectify the situation with Miss Henderson. That includes a formal apology from you." Morgan bristled. "With all due respect, Captain, With all due respect," Harris interrupted, his voice firm, "your actions have put this entire crew under scrutiny. This is no longer about your personal judgment. It's about the airline's reputation. You will apologize, and you will do it professionally. Is that understood?" Morgan's face burned with humiliation, but she nodded stiffly. "Understood." The landing. The wheels of Flight 872 touched down on the runway with a jolt, and the passengers collectively exhaled. As the plane taxied to the gate, Morgan's nerves were frayed to the breaking point. She knew what awaited her. Kayla, on the other hand, remained composed. She retrieved her blazer from her bag and draped it over her arm, her movements deliberate. She was ready for whatever came next. When the plane came to a stop, the intercom crackled to life once more. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Harris announced, "we'd like to thank you for flying with us today. Before disembarking, we ask for your patience as a brief announcement is made." Passengers exchanged curious glances as Morgan stepped into the aisle, her face pale. She cleared her throat and addressed the cabin, her voice shaking slightly. "On behalf of the airline and this crew, I'd like to offer a formal apology to Miss Henderson for the earlier incident. It was a mistake, and it does not reflect the values of this airline. We are committed to ensuring our passengers are treated with the respect they deserve." The cabin fell silent. All eyes were on Kayla, who rose gracefully from her seat in the economy cabin. She adjusted her blazer and walked toward the front of the plane, her posture commanding. As she passed Morgan, she paused, her eyes locking onto the flight attendants. "Thank you for the apology," Kayla said, her voice calm but firm. "I trust it won't happen again." Morgan swallowed hard, unable to meet Kayla's gaze. Kayla continued toward the exit, her every step a statement of quiet power. Behind her, whispers rippled through the cabin, passengers marveling at the unexpected turn of events. But for Kayla, this was just the beginning. She knew that her story wouldn't end on this plane. It was a story of resilience, of standing up against injustice, and of reminding those who underestimated her that actions always have consequences. The unexpected welcome. Kayla Henderson stepped onto the jet bridge, her heels clicking sharply against the metal floor. Behind her, the murmurs of the passengers on board Flight 872 grew quieter as the reality of what had just happened began to settle in. Kayla's demeanor remained unshaken, though her mind raced with thoughts about what lay ahead. She wasn't seeking revenge. What she wanted was accountability, not just for herself, but for anyone who might face a similar situation in the future. As she entered the terminal, she was greeted by an unexpected sight. Two airline executives, dressed in crisp suits, stood waiting near the gate. Their polished shoes and somber expressions made it clear they weren't here for a routine visit. One of them, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes, stepped forward. "Miss Henderson," the woman began, extending her hand. "I'm Eleanor Stokes, CEO of this airline. May I have a moment of your time?" Passengers disembarking behind Kayla slowed their pace, their curiosity palpable as they tried to overhear the exchange. Kayla shook Eleanor's hand firmly, her expression polite but guarded. "Of course," she replied. "Lead the way." Eleanor gestured toward a nearby lounge, where privacy and refreshments awaited. As they walked, Kayla couldn't help but notice the way Eleanor carried herself. Confident, composed, and clearly accustomed to wielding authority. Yet there was something in her tone that suggested genuine concern, which intrigued Kayla. Inside the lounge, Eleanor closed the door, shutting out the bustling terminal noise. She motioned for Kayla to sit before taking the seat across from her. "First, let me extend my deepest apologies for the incident on your flight," Eleanor began, her tone sincere. "What happened to you was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for the actions of my staff." Kayla folded her hands in her lap, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate the apology," she said evenly. "But apologies without action mean little. I'm more interested in how you plan to ensure this doesn't happen again." Eleanor nodded, clearly expecting this response. "You're absolutely right," she said. "That's why I've already initiated a formal investigation into the matter. The flight attendant in question will face disciplinary action, and we'll be implementing additional training for all crew members on implicit bias and customer service." Kayla raised an eyebrow, impressed but skeptical. "And what about accountability at the leadership level? Training is good, but systemic issues often start from the top." Eleanor smiled faintly, a glimmer of respect in her eyes. "You don't miss a beat, do you?" she said. "You're correct again. That's why I'm personally overseeing this process. We'll also be conducting a thorough review of our policies to ensure that incidents like this aren't just addressed, they're prevented." Meanwhile, on the ground. Back on the plane, Morgan Shaw was the last crew member to disembark. She lingered in the galley, her hands trembling slightly as she packed away the last of the service trays. Dennis watched her from the corner of his eye, his expression a mixture of disappointment and pity. "You should have known better," Dennis finally said, breaking the tense silence. "First-class passengers are our bread and butter. But more than that, everyone deserves respect, no matter where they're sitting." Morgan snapped the lid on a tray, her movements abrupt. "I didn't mean for it to get out of hand," she muttered. "I just thought." "That's the problem," Dennis interrupted, his voice firm. "You acted on what you thought, not what you knew. And now the whole airline is paying the price." Morgan didn't respond. Her pride was bruised, but she knew there was truth in Dennis's words. Still, she couldn't shake the knot of resentment in her chest. It wasn't her fault, she told herself, not entirely. But deep down, she knew she'd miscalculated, and there was no undoing it now. A public statement. As Kayla and Eleanor continued their conversation in the lounge, a ripple effect was unfolding in the airport terminal. News of the incident had reached the media, thanks in part to the young woman on the flight who had tweeted about it. By the time the passengers of Flight 872 collected their luggage, the story had already started trending on social media under the hashtag first-class bias. Eleanor's phone buzzed with notifications as her communications team sent her updates. She glanced at the screen briefly before turning her attention back to Kayla. "It seems the public is already weighing in," Eleanor said, her tone measured. "If you're open to it, I'd like to issue a joint statement addressing the incident and the steps we're taking to improve." Kayla tilted her head slightly, considering the proposal. "A joint statement would be a good start," she said, "but I'd like to review it before it's released. This isn't just about your airline's reputation. It's about setting an example." "Agreed," Eleanor said without hesitation. "I'll have my team draft something immediately. We'll send it to you for approval." As their conversation continued, Kayla couldn't help but feel a growing respect for Eleanor. The CEO's willingness to take responsibility and involve Kayla in the resolution process was a stark contrast to the arrogance she had encountered earlier on the flight. The consequences for Morgan. By the time Morgan exited the plane, she was met by an airline representative who escorted her to a conference room near the crew quarters. Waiting inside was a member of the HR team, whose expression was as serious as the situation demanded. Morgan Shaw, the HR representative, began, "Your actions on Flight 872 have been brought to our attention, and we need to address them immediately." Morgan sank into the chair across from the representative, her earlier defiance giving way to unease. "I didn't mean for it to escalate," she said, her voice quieter now. "I thought I was acting in the best interest of the passengers." The HR representative didn't flinch. "That may have been your intention, but your actions demonstrated a clear lack of judgment and professionalism. Miss Henderson is not only a valued customer, but also someone with significant influence. Your treatment of her has damaged the airline's reputation, and we take that very seriously." Morgan's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. "So what happens now?" "For now, you're being placed on administrative leave while we conduct a full investigation," the HR representative said firmly. "Depending on the outcome, further disciplinary action may be taken." Morgan's shoulders slumped. She nodded wordlessly, the gravity of the situation sinking in. A new beginning. As Kayla prepared to leave the airport, Eleanor walked her to the exit, their conversation having shifted to more personal topics. "You know," Eleanor said, "you'd make an excellent consultant for our diversity and inclusion program. Someone with your perspective could make a real difference." Kayla chuckled softly. "I think I've had enough excitement for one day," she replied. "But I'll keep the offer in mind." Eleanor extended her hand once more. "Thank you, Miss Henderson, for your patience, your insight, and your willingness to hold us accountable." Kayla shook her hand firmly. "Thank you, Ms. Stokes, for taking this seriously. I hope your actions match your words." With that, Kayla stepped out into the crisp Chicago air, her head held high. She knew this wasn't the end of the story, not for her, not for the airline, and certainly not for Morgan. But as she hailed a cab and climbed into the back seat, she allowed herself a small smile. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a step forward for everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or mistreated. And in her heart, she knew the ripple effects of her actions would be felt far beyond the confines of that airplane. The ripple effect. The story of Flight 872 wasn't contained to the airport terminal. Within hours of landing, the hashtag first-class spias had climbed to the top of social media trends, fueled by posts from passengers, witnesses, and even former employees of the airline. Stories of similar incidents surfaced, painting a picture of systemic issues that had long been swept under the rug. What had started as one passenger's experience was rapidly becoming a public reckoning for the airline industry. Kayla Henderson, meanwhile, had retreated to the relative calm of her hotel room. As she unpacked her luggage, her phone vibrated incessantly on the desk. Emails from media outlets, texts from friends, and notifications from social media poured in, all demanding her attention. Kayla ignored most of them, her focus directed at drafting an email to Eleanor Stokes regarding their joint statement. Her thoughts were interrupted by a call from Marcia Fletcher. "Kayla," Marcia began, her tone brisk but concerned, "the story's gone viral. I've been fielding calls all day from reporters, from advocacy groups, even from rival airlines looking to seize the moment. How do you want to play this?" Kayla sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the comforter. "I want to be strategic," she said. "This isn't about me anymore. It's about the bigger picture. Let's use this momentum to push for real change, not just at this airline, but industry-wide." Marcia's voice softened. "That's why I'm proud to back you. You see the long game when others would just chase headlines." Kayla smiled faintly. "Thanks, Marcia. Let's start by making sure Eleanor and her team follow through on their promises. If they don't, then we escalate." The internal firestorm. At the airline's headquarters, Chaos reigned. Eleanor Stokes had summoned her executive team for an emergency meeting, the gravity of the situation evident in their tense expressions. "We have a PR crisis on our hands," Eleanor said, pacing at the head of the table. "This isn't just about Miss Henderson anymore. It's about our entire brand. We've positioned ourselves as a customer-first airline, and now that claim is under fire. I want solutions, not excuses." One of the executives, a younger man with thick-rimmed glasses, spoke hesitantly. "We could issue a public apology and highlight our commitment to improving customer experience." Eleanor stopped pacing and fixed him with a sharp gaze. "That's the bare minimum. We need tangible actions, training programs, policy reviews, and real accountability. Otherwise, this will blow up in our faces." The room fell silent until another executive, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, spoke up. "What about reaching out to Kayla directly? She's a prominent figure, and her voice carries weight. If we can bring her on board as a consultant or advocate, it could turn the narrative in our favor." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "It's a good idea. I've already spoken with her, and she's willing to collaborate, for now. Let's not squander that goodwill." As the meeting continued, Eleanor's assistant entered the room, her face pale. "Ma'am," she said, handing Eleanor a tablet, "this just came through." Eleanor's eyes scanned the screen, her expression hardening. The young woman from the flight had posted a detailed thread about the incident, complete with photos and witness accounts. The post had garnered thousands of likes and shares within minutes. "Great," Eleanor muttered under her breath. "The last thing we need is more fuel on the fire." Morgan faces the fallout. Back at her small apartment, Morgan Shaw sat on the edge of her couch, staring blankly at the email on her laptop screen. It was from the airline's HR department, and it wasn't good news. Subject: Notice of temporary suspension. Dear Miss Shaw, following the incident on Flight 872 and the subsequent investigation, we have decided to place you on temporary suspension effective immediately. You will remain on leave pending the outcome of our inquiry. A formal hearing will be scheduled, during which you may present your side of the story. Regards, Human Resources Department. Morgan's hands clenched into fists as she reread the email. She felt a mix of anger and humiliation. She had always prided herself on being a capable, no-nonsense professional, but now her career was hanging by a thread. Worse, she couldn't shake the nagging realization that she had brought this on herself. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dennis. "Dennis, I warned you, Morgan. You need to own up to this. It's the only way forward." Morgan threw her phone onto the couch in frustration. She wasn't ready to face the consequences, not yet. Kayla speaks out. The next morning, Kayla finally decided to address the public. She opened her laptop, logged into her social media accounts, and began typing a post that would set the tone for the conversation. Kayla Henderson. Yesterday, I had an experience that highlighted the need for systemic change in the airline industry. It wasn't just about a seat. It was about respect, fairness, and accountability. I'm grateful for the swift response from the airline's leadership, particularly CEO Eleanor Stokes, who has committed to addressing this issue head-on. But this is bigger than one flight or one company. It's about ensuring that every passenger, regardless of who they are or where they sit, is treated with dignity. I look forward to working with the airline to implement meaningful changes. Together, we can set a new standard for the industry. The post went live, and within minutes it was flooded with comments and shares. Advocacy groups praised Kayla's measured response, while passengers from around the world shared their own stories of mistreatment. The dialogue was growing, and Kayla was at its center. The first steps toward change. Eleanor kept her promise. Within a week, the airline announced a comprehensive plan to address the issues raised by Kayla's incident. The plan included mandatory training programs. All employees, from flight attendants to executives, would undergo training on implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and customer service excellence. Passenger Advocacy Council. A new advisory board, with Kayla as one of its founding members, would oversee policy changes and ensure accountability. Transparency measures. The airline pledged to publicly release annual reports on customer feedback and the steps taken to address complaints. The announcement was met with cautious optimism. Kayla, while satisfied with the initial steps, remained vigilant. "This is only the beginning," she told Marcia during a call. "Accountability is a process, not a one-time event." Morgan's turning point. Weeks later, Morgan sat in a sterile conference room at the airline's headquarters, facing a panel of HR representatives and executives. Her hearing had arrived, and it was her chance to explain her actions or attempt to salvage her career. As she recounted her version of events, Morgan's voice wavered. For the first time, she acknowledged her mistake. "I let my biases cloud my judgment," she admitted. "I acted impulsively, and I failed to uphold the standards of my position. I'm deeply sorry for the harm I caused." The panel listened intently, their expressions neutral. When Morgan finished, Eleanor, who was sitting in as an observer, leaned forward. "Miss Shaw," Eleanor said, her tone firm but not unkind, "acknowledging your mistake is a good first step. But actions speak louder than words. If you want to remain with this airline, you'll need to commit to real growth and prove that you can embody the values we stand for." Morgan nodded, her eyes downcast. "I understand. Thank you for the opportunity." The road ahead. For Kayla, Morgan, and Eleanor, the incident on Flight 872 became a turning point. Kayla's advocacy efforts gained momentum, leading to broader discussions about equity in travel and beyond. Morgan, though humbled, began working to rebuild her career and learn from her mistakes, and Eleanor used the crisis as a catalyst to transform her airline into a model of accountability and innovation. The ripple effects of that single flight continued to spread, reminding everyone involved that change often begins in the most unexpected ways. And for Kayla Henderson, it was proof that one voice, calm, composed, and unwavering, could ignite a movement. A legacy of change. Months had passed since Flight 872, and the airline had become a case study in crisis management and corporate reform. The once scandalous incident had transformed into a blueprint for accountability, thanks in no small part to Kayla Henderson's persistence and Eleanor Stokes' leadership. Yet the work was far from over. While progress had been made, the lessons of that day continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Kayla sat in her San Francisco office, the skyline of the bustling city framed behind her. Her desk was cluttered with papers, contracts, and sticky notes, a testament to her ever-growing responsibilities. Since the incident, her profile had risen significantly. She was no longer just the founder of a promising tech startup. She was now a sought-after advocate for equity in corporate practices, her voice a rallying cry for underrepresented communities. Her assistant, Marcy, knocked gently on the door before stepping inside. "Kayla, your 3 o'clock is here. Eleanor Stokes and the advisory board team." Kayla smiled faintly. "Right on time. Let's set up in the conference room." As she walked down the hall, Kayla reflected on how far they had come. The Passenger Advocacy Council, one of the airline's promised reforms, was no longer just an idea. It was a fully operational body with real influence, composed of diverse voices from customers, employees, and industry experts. Today's meeting was their quarterly review, and Kayla was determined to ensure the council stayed true to its mission. The advisory board's first test. In the sleek, glass-walled conference room, Eleanor greeted Kayla warmly. The CEO looked noticeably more relaxed than the last time they had met, though her professionalism remained intact. "Kayla," Eleanor said, shaking her hand, "it's good to see you again. Your input has been invaluable to this process." Kayla nodded. "Likewise, Eleanor. Let's dive in." The meeting began with a presentation from the council's project manager, outlining the progress made since the incident. Highlights included policy overhauls. A new passenger grievance process had been implemented, allowing customers to report issues directly to the advisory board. Employee retraining. Over 90% of the airline staff had completed mandatory bias and sensitivity training, with measurable improvements in customer feedback scores. Real-time accountability. Flight attendants and other crew members were now equipped with technology to report and resolve in-flight disputes immediately. As the presentation concluded, Kayla leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. "This is a good start," she said, "but we need to talk about what's next. Sustained change requires more than policies. It requires culture. How do we ensure that this momentum doesn't fade?" Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "That's a question we've been grappling with as well. We're considering making the training an annual requirement, not a one-time event. And we're looking into expanding the advisory board's role beyond passenger issues to include broader corporate governance." Kayla smiled. "That's the kind of forward thinking we need, but let's not forget accountability at the individual level." Eleanor glanced at her, understanding the unspoken subtext. "You mean Morgan Shaw." Morgan's redemption. After her suspension, Morgan Shaw had faced a difficult road. The hearing had been a humbling experience, but it was only the beginning of her journey. Determined to prove herself, she enrolled in courses on cultural competency and leadership ethics, taking her professional development into her own hands. Now she was back at work, though in a different capacity. The airline had reassigned her to a training and development role, where she was responsible for helping new employees navigate the complexities of customer service. In the months since her return, Morgan had transformed from a figure of controversy to one of redemption. She took her role seriously, often drawing from her own experiences to teach others. During one training session, she addressed a group of newly hired flight attendants. "Let me tell you about the biggest mistake I ever made," she began, her tone candid but firm. "I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. I forgot that every passenger is a person first, not just a ticket or a seat number. That mistake almost cost me my career, but it taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Respect isn't optional, it's essential." The room was silent, her words hanging in the air. For Morgan, it wasn't about erasing her past mistakes. It was about turning them into a tool for growth. The broader impact. Kayla's advocacy extended beyond the airline industry. She began speaking at conferences and corporate events, sharing her story as a way to inspire change across sectors. Her TED Talk, titled "Turning Adversity into Action. Lessons from 30,000 Feet," went viral, drawing millions of views. In it, she recounted the events of Flight 872 and the ripple effects that followed. "Change doesn't happen by accident," she told the audience. "It happens when people refuse to accept the status quo. It happens when we demand better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone." Her words resonated deeply, sparking conversations in boardrooms and workplaces across the globe. Companies began reevaluating their policies, and employees found renewed courage to speak up against injustice. A new chapter for the airline. Under Eleanor's leadership, the airline underwent a cultural transformation. The Passenger Advocacy Council became a permanent fixture, its recommendations leading to sweeping changes in how the company operated. Customer satisfaction ratings improved, and the airline began receiving accolades for its commitment to inclusivity and innovation. Eleanor and Kayla's partnership became a symbol of what was possible when corporate leaders and advocates worked together. At one press event, Eleanor stood beside Kayla as they unveiled a new initiative, the Kayla Henderson Scholarship Fund, which provided financial support to underrepresented students pursuing careers in aviation and technology. "This fund isn't just about scholarships," Eleanor said. "It's about creating opportunities and fostering a new generation of leaders who will carry these values forward." Kayla nodded, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "This isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning. Together, we're proving that change is possible, and that when we work together, the sky isn't the limit. It's just the start." The personal triumph. Back at her office, Kayla received a package marked with the airline's logo. Inside was a handwritten letter from Eleanor, accompanied by a symbolic gift, A first-class ticket for any destination of Kayla's choice, valid indefinitely. The letter read, "Dear Kayla, as a gesture of gratitude for your resilience and your partnership, we want to offer you this small token. It's not just a ticket. It's a reminder of how far we've come and the heights we can reach together. Sincerely, Eleanor." Kayla smiled as she folded the letter and placed it on her desk. For her, the ticket wasn't about the luxury. It was about what it represented: progress, redemption, and the power of one voice to ignite a movement. She knew there was still work to be done, but for now, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. The incident on Flight 872 had been a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone involved. And as she gazed out at the San Francisco skyline, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Change was in the air, and Kayla Henderson was ready to soar. Taking flight, Kayla Henderson sat at her desk, the symbolic first-class ticket resting beside her laptop. For a moment, she allowed herself to savor the quiet triumph of how far she had come, not just in her personal journey, but in the impact she had helped create. Yet she knew that this was not the end. If anything, it was the beginning of a broader, more purposeful chapter in her life. The buzz of her phone interrupted her thoughts. It was a call from Eleanor Stokes. "Kayla," Eleanor began, her tone warm, "I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done, not just for our airline, but for setting an example for the industry. We couldn't have done this without your insight." Kayla smiled faintly. "I appreciate that, Eleanor, but this was a team effort. You didn't just listen. You acted. That's rare." Eleanor chuckled softly. "Well, I had good reason to. People like you don't come along every day. We'd like to invite you to join us for the official unveiling of the Passenger Advocacy Council's long-term initiatives next month. It's going to be a big event, and your presence would mean a lot." Kayla considered it for a moment before replying. "I'd be honored. Let me know the details." As the call ended, Kayla glanced at the first-class ticket once more. Her mind raced with the possibilities of where she could go, but she realized that the journey she had started months ago was far more significant than any destination. The final flight. A month later, Kayla stood on the stage at the unveiling ceremony for the Passenger Advocacy Council's long-term initiatives. The event had drawn leaders from across industries, activists, and members of the press, all eager to see how one airline had turned a crisis into a movement for change. Eleanor introduced Kayla to the audience. "Miss Henderson is not only a successful entrepreneur, but a change-maker who refused to let adversity silence her. She turned a moment of injustice into an opportunity for transformation, not just for us, but for the entire industry." As Kayla approached the podium, the audience erupted into applause. She took a deep breath, her calm, composed demeanor projecting confidence. "Thank you, Eleanor," Kayla began, "and thank you to everyone who made today possible. When I boarded that flight months ago, I never imagined we'd be here. What started as a personal experience became a collective call for accountability and equity. This isn't just about me or even about this airline. It's about the values we choose to uphold as individuals, as companies, and as a society." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. Change isn't easy, and it isn't fast, but it's necessary. And when we face challenges with courage and clarity, we pave the way for others to follow. Today, we've taken another step toward a future where respect and dignity are not privileges but rights. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Kayla remained humble, knowing that her work was far from finished. Closing the loop. After the ceremony, Kayla found herself standing beside Eleanor in a quieter corner of the venue. They watched as attendees mingled, discussing the initiatives and their potential impact. "Do you ever feel like this is just the tip of the iceberg?" Eleanor asked, her tone thoughtful. Kayla nodded. "All the time. But that's the nature of progress. You chip away at the surface until the cracks start to show. Then you dig deeper." Eleanor smiled. "Well, if anyone can keep us digging, it's you." Kayla returned the smile. And if anyone can make sure the digging leads somewhere meaningful, it's you. As the evening wound down, Kayla stepped outside, the cool breeze of the city brushing against her skin. She pulled out her phone and opened her travel app, staring at the list of destinations. She thought about the first-class ticket Eleanor had sent her and decided to use it, not for leisure, but for purpose. Her destination, a small aviation school in a rural town, where she had agreed to give a talk to students dreaming of a future in flight. It was a fitting choice, she thought. After all, the next generation would inherit the skies they were striving to make fairer. Epilogue. Soaring beyond. Kayla's journey from passenger to advocate became a story that inspired many. The changes implemented by the airline set a new standard for the industry, proving that even large corporations could be held accountable when individuals demanded better. Morgan Shaw, too, found redemption, her experiences shaping her into a more empathetic and effective leader in her new role. For Kayla, the experience reaffirmed her belief that no challenge was insurmountable when met with determination and integrity. She continued to advocate for change, using her voice to lift others and pave the way for a better future. As the plane took off for her next journey, Kayla looked out the window at the clouds below. They reminded her of how far she had come, and how far she was yet to go. But she wasn't afraid. She was ready to soar, knowing that the sky was no longer the limit. It was just the beginning.